Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, we're looking at American independence. This is when, the United States becomes the United States of America. It goes from being 13 disparate colonies to being a country with the writing of with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. But the United States needs to put together a constitution. So the U.S. Constitution, which was written and ratified in 1787, mostly put together by Virginians. Virginians were prominent amongst those who rebelled against the British. And Virginia was a slave-owning society. It was a plantation economy. Despite the historical claims that they did not like the institution, the founding fathers, especially Virginians, were very active, enthusiastic, profiting actors in the slave trade and in the plantation economy. They owned, sold, and some of them did in fact rape their slaves, like was actually quite common amongst slave masters. The Virginians were a significant cadre of financial and philosophical support for the revolution. At one point, as I talked about earlier, Jefferson kind of disingenuously tries to place blame on England for the practice of and presence of slavery, but it's a hard sell given that his entire fortune is dependent on it. They were very pro-slavery in practice and policy, although at some point, certainly Thomas Jefferson does voice reservations about the morality of it. Jefferson and James Madison are the principal authors of the Constitution, more Jefferson than Madison. So the Constitution, there's some opponents to the Constitution. These are the Federalists. These are people who feared concentration in power in the executive branch. From the Stamp Act through the Revolutionary War, they're very much against this idea of strong federal, strong central government, right? But they failed to create a sense of urgency amongst their supporters. They thought a large majority would rally to them, and that didn't happen. The Federalists they prevail. The Constitution becomes the law of the land when the ninth state, New Hampshire, ratifies it on June 21st, 1787. The Federalists were those who preferred a strong central government, and they basically win out. So on September 17, 1787, the U.S. Constitution is approved and ratified. This reconciled the interests of large and small states theoretically, created a strong national government, balanced delegates' desire for a strong national government against interference from other states, right? So kind of preserves somewhat of the autonomy of the individual states, and at the same time, has this strong central government that can have like a foreign policy, a currency, taxes, this sort of thing. So the U.S. Constitution creates three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The idea is to design this system of checks and balances to prevent one branch from dominating others. The Constitution also embodied a form of federalism, a system of fair shared power and dual lawmaking by the state and the national government, in order to limit central authority. So state legislatures or state governments had a key role in electing the presidents and senators, but the Constitution could be amended by votes of three-fourths of state legislatures, so that the states could actually help to shape and amend and change the Constitution. Federalism assumed that the national government would limit its activities to foreign affairs, national defense, the regulation of commerce, and the coining of money. Political matters would be left to the state. So the legislative branch of the federal government is the House of Representatives and Congress. The executive branch is the presidency, and the judicial branch is the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, as I said, we talked about this earlier. Slavery is indirectly and directly referred to in the Constitution, right? In the southern states, there was this debate over representation. Southern states did not want to be overwhelmed in Congress, right? Because Congress is proportional. How many congressmen you get depends on your population, but every state gets two senators. So in Congress, they feared they would be weakened. So they wanted to count their slaves in population, right? Enslaved Africans who were probably about 60 to 70% of their population as full persons for representational purposes. And the New Englanders and the other states that didn't have these huge populations of slaves, but did have slaves, maybe a few here and there, like Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, they pushed back against this. So a compromise was made called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And it's a clause in the Constitution that basically said that the states that had these huge population of enslaved people could count it as three-fifths of a person. Also, the Fugitive Slave Act was written into fugitive slave clauses in the Constitution. Kind of, it's in there under the understanding of the property rights of the individual, right? And this gave slave owners, no one else, the right to cross state lines to retrieve enslaved people who had fled, right? And then, of course, suffrage again is only for white men. So, yeah, this slavery is pretty much understood it that's going to be part of the Republic in 1787. Later on, in fact, the 1793 Slave Act is written to basically make that clause a law. So the Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the Constitution, very important to anti-federalists. It was not in the original document. It's 10 amendments. And those are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They include freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the Second Amendment, free right to bear arms, and it refers to not quartering soldiers in people's houses. It refers to property rights, the right to have a due process and these sorts of things. And number 10 is states' rights. It's a good idea to know those 10 amendments. And here they are right here. First one, freedom of speech and religion. Second one, the right to bear arms. A lot of debate about that, whether it's an individual right or a right of the states. The third one, no soldiers can be quartered in your home. Remember, I talked about how soldiers were being brought here and Bostonians were being forced to put them up in their homes. The Fourth Amendment has to do with search and seizure, so you can't be searched without a warrant. The fifth one has to do with due process of law. The state can't just grab you. Of course, there's speedy trial by jury, no cruel and unusual punishment. And then, of course, it talks about their other rights, maybe not enumerated, and those will be included in other amendments. I think we have up north of 20 amendments now at this one. And the last one's going to be states' rights, the right of the states to basically govern themselves. And that's going to be a big debate during the Civil War. Judicial review. Now, the right of the Supreme Court, the judicial branch of government, to interpret laws, right? And after these laws, after these cases, judicial review becomes a thing. Marbury versus Madison, Flecker versus Peck, right? This is basically where the judicial branch kind of flexes its muscles and it says that something is unconstitutional and strikes it down. And again, the United States Supreme Court is supposed to act as a check on executive, legislative, and state power by interpreting the Constitution and keeping those branches from enacting legislation or laws that go against the Constitution. Now, the paradox of U.S. race ideology. So we talked about, again, when you read the Declaration of Independence, when you contemplate and think about the principles that are supposed to embody the Republic, it seems paradoxical, right? That, again, the founding fathers would have these kind of views. But this is basically a quote from Thomas Jefferson talking about enslaved African people, right? And again, it's quite convenient that a slave owner would believe these things, that that they require less sleep, that they'll sit up all night, get up early and still work. They don't really care. That their griefs are transient, meaning that they don't experience grief like other people, right? That their suffering is soon forgotten with them, right? And so this is really quite profound that a slave owner would think this, but of course, again, we know quite objectively this is not accurate, but it's the kind of thing that slave owners probably told themselves to be able to live with what they were doing. So Jeffersonian ideals were very much a huge part of this republic. He wanted a robust republic of commerce, small government, and a focus on civil liberties. But again, he reflected these Enlightenment ideas about race, right? Which actually really challenged his ideas of republicanism, right? And again, he legitimized categorizations of humans while expressing the ideal of individual freedoms and equality, and he explained away this paradox, right? By embracing these ideas about race, right, as human beings divided into racial categories and in a hierarchy, and that some people didn't suffer as much as others, or some people needed to be enslaved. Again, and this is once again kind of contradicted by the fact that he, for a great deal of his life, a long period of his life, he had a young woman who, from when she was 13 until he died, was he, there's no other way to put it other than to say that he raped her, he impregnated her with several children. And again, despite him insisting that this is another category of humanity, he fathered these children. And eventually, when he died, she was able to negotiate before he died an agreement that he would release them from captivity, from enslavement, which he did do. And again, race very much becomes a part of the republic because race is such an important category in terms of defining where you are in society. Free white persons as an ideal, first of all, symbolically erase the ethnic diversity of American society, right? Making all so-called Europeans white, right? And but again, it also, you had to be, in order to enjoy the freedoms and the citizenship and the benefits of U.S. citizenship, you had to be a free white person. Free white males specifically became the prototypical America, right? A prototypical American, right? So this creates a society that rendered the voices and the impacts of the various ethnicities invisible. African people, indigenous people, later on Asian people, and even other, sometimes other European immigrants, when they get here, they have to work their way into this category of being white or whiteness. This is something that is very much socially constructed, but it made it so that whiteness equaled citizenship and protection, and the very definition of a human, and other people were rendered outside of that boundary. So slavery and expansion really went hand in hand right up into the Civil War. The Southern plantation economy, the pillar of it was expansion. It created a planter elite among the most richest and most powerful people in our demographic in the Western world. They expanded west and south, constantly seeking land to expand their plantations into. A lot of times, what they would do is they would literally exhaust the soil in areas and start moving into other areas, right? Plantation economies were challenging. They didn't have a lot of industry. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for people who were not plantation owners. So a lot of the free population of whites were quite impoverished. But this ideology of race and national identity very much become merged, right, with this expansion into indigenous people land. Again, the assumption being that they don't have a right to that land, and along with that, the bringing of slavery into those territories. So around 5,000 former, well, not former, 5,000 enslaved men, a lot of them having escaped or what have you, fought for American independence. Far more enslaved people obtained freedom under the British. Something like 100,000 enslaved individuals, including 25% of the enslaved people in South Carolina, and a third of those in Georgia deserted their owners and fled the British line. Some were captured as the war turned in favor of the Americans, but at war's end, 20,000 were living in three enclaves of British control in New York, Charlestown, and Savannah. More than 15,000, between 15,000 and 20,000 Black women, men, and children accompanied the British out of the country. A lot of them settled in Sierra Leone and also in Trinidad. And later on, many of them will continue to fight for the British Empire. The Northwest Ordinance we spoke of earlier of 1787 basically was a statutory and cultural standard for expansion. It sets the pattern for further expansion west. in the new republic. It claimed good faith in dealing with indigenous people, prohibited slavery north of the Ohio River. And then basically, what their idea is, and Jefferson talks about this quote, empire of liberty, unquote, where territories would eventually become states. During initial years of settlement, Congress would appoint a territorial governor and judges. As soon as 5,000 adult males lived in a territory, voters could approve a territorial constitution and elect a legislature. When the total population reached 60,000 voters, they could ratify a state constitution, which Congress would approve before granting statehood. So this kind of the twinning of territorial expansion. And again, it's very much white male self-government. So the first immigration law passed by the United States of America, which sets the standards for citizenship, was the 1790 Naturalization Act. It basically stated that, quote, free white persons of good character, unquote, could become citizens as long as they had recommendations, and children were, quote, natural born citizens, unquote. So the United States becomes a nation of immigrants, but again, they're excluding African Americans, who are probably about 30 to 40% of the population. They're excluding Native Americans. They're certainly excluding Asians, right? Again, this category of whiteness becomes the standard. So more on expansion, the Haitian Revolution, the Louisiana Purchase, territorial expansion, and slavery. So the Haitian Revolution is really important to United States history because the United States literally expands it's the country, it doubles the size of the country territorially because of it. From 1791 to 1804, this is an uprising, a slave revolt on Saint-Domingue, the French island, which later on is going to be called Haiti. In 1791, Duty Boukman began the slave revolt with a indigenous African prayer and slaughtering a pig. Enslaved Africans basically just rose up and began to slaughter their masters. Free blacks and people of color decide to ally themselves with the enslaved people. Toussaint Louverture, a black freeman, eventually rises up to lead the revolution as again the free blacks and the free people of color basically kind of, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say they co-opt the revolution. And they're going to succeed. I mean, this is going to not really scare the heck out of slave owners all over the Americas, in Central America, South America, North America. A lot of refugees from Haiti are going to end up in Louisiana, bringing tales of horror, and in South Carolina. The Haitians win, but they're forced to basically pay reparations to the French. The U.S. basically refused to recognize them until they would. They didn't recognize them as a country until 1862, so that kind of quelched their ability to engage in trade. French attempts at reconquest fail miserably. Eventually, the French sell the Louisiana territories to the United States in 1804. And this is this huge swath of territory you see right here, from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, and from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Napoleon decides to sell this area because it's of little use to him without Haiti. There's not a lot of French settlers in this area, and he feels like he's going to lose it anyway. He's focused on conquering Europe and building his empire there. He doesn't have the manpower to hold on to this territory in the face of Anglos already flooding into it by probably the thousands. He approaches Thomas Jefferson, who Thomas Jefferson actually had offered just to buy New Orleans. The French respond with an offer to sell the entire territory for $15 million. So for a paltry $15 million, the United States gets this huge swath of territory and literally doubles the size of the country. One of the things that Jefferson does, he asks William Clark and Meriwether Lewis to basically recon and map the newly acquired territories. They do. They map the territory. They recon the indigenous people and intelligence report back on them. They basically take about a year and a half to do this. It's basically an act of not only establishing U.S. sovereignty and contacting indigenous people and kind of informing them that they're now under the dominion of the United States. And sometimes they didn't receive that message in the way that Lewis and Clark hoped they would. But they bring along with them a woman by the name of Sacagawea, who is crucial to the mission. She was a wife of a French trapper who knew several indigenous languages and kind of really helped with their interactions in that way. Also, William Clark brought York, an enslaved black man, with him. He was treated as equal only while on the expedition. He was never freed. In fact, Clark writes of having to beat him for being, quote, uppity, unquote, when they return. Basically, what they're doing on this is they're trying to map this area, but then they also hope that they would find a shorter passage way to the Pacific. They had no idea, no real idea of how large the continent was. They're looking for this fabled Northwest Passage that they never find. Um, he as they go through, they're informing the people, the indigenous people they encounter, that they now own the land. I think most of the indigenous people are amused or thought them are curious sort of folks and didn't pay them much mind, maybe traded with them a little bit. European notions of land ownership were not necessarily compatible with indigenous notions of how the land is used. One group that they did encounter were the Lakota, and the Lakota are very powerful plains nation that had conquered many and driven out many of the other indigenous nations. And Clark did not like their demands for permission and for a gift to pass through their territory. And basically almost came to blows with them, but it's settled. It doesn't happen. But his reports back to Washington is that they're going to be a problem. So the United States dramatically expands its territory with this, more than doubled the size of the United States. But every time a new territory becomes a state after this, the conflict over slavery is going to be exacerbated. So it sets up conditions for North-South conflict that later on leads to the Civil War. This vast frontier and the idea of, quote, free land, unquote, is understood as open land for white settlement and spaces where the poor and dispossessed of the white population could kind of escape to and kind of be part of this experiment in republicanism and freedom and that sort of thing. Pressure will begin to build upon the central government of the United States to grab the Spanish territories or at least encroach upon them, as you can see on this map right here. And this will lead eventually to another conflict with the country of Mexico. So in conclusion, the United States of America becomes a constitutional republic in 1787 with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which includes the three branches of government, this idea of checks and balances, this idea of not having an overly powerful executive branch, a republic with proportional representation, but also a Senate, proportional representation being the House of Representatives, the Senate being, two senators for every state. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, establishing this notion of civil liberty and individual liberties, again, very specific. And again, expansion, very much a part of this project. And with the Louisiana Purchase, not really that long after the Revolutionary War, the size of the country doubles. Expansion begins in the North and in the South. Expansion is going to begin. And again, every time there's a new state below the Mason-Dixon line, as we'll discuss where that is later, there's going to be a debate over the issue of slavery. Lewis and Clark are the ones who are responsible for mapping that territory. And again, discovering that territory is a lot bigger and this continent is a lot more vast than people had thought. They travel all the way from the Mississippi, from around Louisiana, around the Mississippi River, all the way up into modern day Washington state. So they go pretty far. Slavery is very much intact. In 1787, it's going to be very much a significant part of the economy of the United States. But this is basically a quote, white man's republic, unquote. Again, those principles established in the Constitution and Declaration are really only meant for this particular demographic.